Dr. Elizabeth Keller never intended to change the course of human evolution, let alone unlock powers that defied everything science stood for. It was supposed to be a routine physics experiment at the renowned OmniTech Research Institute. In the sterile, state-of-the-art lab, she and her team had been studying the effects of quantum particle manipulation on matter, hoping to make breakthroughs in renewable energy. But what they discovered would alter humanity forever. The day it all began seemed like any other. The lab buzzed with the usual hum of machinery, and the sterile white walls of OmniTech's main research facility reflected the bright artificial lights. Elizabeth, a physicist with 2 PhDs under her belt, had devoted her life to understanding the fundamental forces that governed the universe. She had no time for fantasy or fiction. Everything could be explained by science, or so she thought. Her team was on the brink of something monumental, a breakthrough in the manipulation of quantum fields to generate boundless energy. They had spent years refining the equations, perfecting the machinery, and gathering the necessary materials. The experiment, dubbed Project Nexus, was designed to stabilize quantum fluctuations in a controlled environment, opening new pathways for clean, limitless power. "All systems are go," said Dr. Ian Foster, her colleague and longtime friend, as he checked the monitors. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of excitement. They had run the calculations countless times, and everything pointed to this being their moment. Elizabeth nodded, her fingers poised over the console, initiating Nexus sequence in 3, 2, 1. With a soft click, the machine roared to life. Beams of light flickered across the room as the quantum field generator spun up, creating an invisible bubble of manipulated energy. At first, everything seemed to be progressing as expected, but then, the readings began to fluctuate. "That's strange," Ian muttered, frowning at the screen. "We're seeing an unexpected increase in particle density. It shouldn't be possible at this phase." Before Elizabeth could respond, a deafening crack filled the air, followed by a shockwave that knocked everyone in the room to the floor. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered violently. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself felt warped, as if the universe had taken a breath before something extraordinary happened. Then it did. The machine, instead of collapsing under the stress of the quantum anomaly, seemed to stabilize. But it wasn't just stabilizing, it was amplifying. The containment field glowed brighter and brighter until it burst, releasing a wave of energy unlike anything they had ever seen. Elizabeth tried to shield her eyes, but it was too late. The energy wave passed through them all, its force rippling across the room and sending equipment crashing to the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood, disoriented. In the aftermath, the hum of the machinery had stopped. Silence filled the air. Is everyone okay?" she called out, her voice shaky. Ian groaned as he pulled himself up from the ground, but before he could answer, something remarkable happened. The heavy steel beam that had fallen from the ceiling, a piece of equipment easily weighing over a ton, shifted, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it rose into the air, as if lifted by an invisible hand. Elizabeth's heart froze as she saw the source of the movement. Ian was standing beneath the beam, his hands gripping the metal tightly, muscles straining as he hoisted the massive structure effortlessly. "What the hell?" Ian whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't sound hurt or frightened, just confused. Elizabeth stared in shock. "Ian, how are you?" I don't know," he gasped, eyes wide. "I just felt like I could." The rest of the team had gathered around, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear, as Ian gently lowered the beam to the ground. Elizabeth's mind raced. This wasn't possible. No human being had the strength to do what Ian had just done. And yet, there he stood, breathless but otherwise unharmed, having performed a feat of strength that defied every law of physics she had ever studied. "We need to run tests," Elizabeth said quickly, her scientific curiosity overriding her shock. "Everyone, to the medical bay, now." The team scrambled to comply, still reeling from the events of the last few minutes. Ian was subjected to every scan and test Elizabeth could think of, but the results were inconclusive. His heart rate was normal, his brain activity was steady, there was no explanation for his sudden surge of strength. "It doesn't make sense," she muttered, pacing the length of the lab as Ian flexed his hands experimentally. "Your body shouldn't be capable of lifting that kind of weight. And yet, what if the energy wave did something to us?" Ian suggested, his voice tentative. "I mean, it passed right through us, right? Maybe it changed something inside me." Elizabeth stopped pacing, Her eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. The Nexus field had manipulated quantum particles at a fundamental level. If the energy wave had altered their physiology, somehow reconfiguring their molecular structure, then maybe, just maybe, it had unlocked latent abilities hidden deep within the human genome. The implications were staggering, but before Elizabeth could dwell on it, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Keller, you need to see this. We've detected similar anomalies across the entire facility." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Ian, her heart pounding. "Let's go." When they arrived at the central command room, chaos had erupted. People were running around in a panic, and security personnel were shouting orders. On the monitors, Elizabeth could see various lab workers performing incredible feats of strength, lifting vehicles, smashing through solid walls, even leaping great distances in a single bound. It wasn't just Ian, the entire research facility had been affected. "Oh my God." Elizabeth breathed. "It's spreading." Ian's face paled. "What do we do?" Before Elizabeth could answer, a loud crash came from the far end of the room. The doors burst open, and a group of security guards rushed in, struggling to restrain one of their own, a man who had apparently lost control of his newfound strength. He thrashed wildly, sending the guards flying with barely a flick of his wrist. "We have to contain this," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "We need to find out what's happening, how it's happening, and stop it before anyone else gets hurt." Over the next few days, the situation spiraled out of control. Word of the experiment and its unintended consequences leaked out, and soon the media was in a frenzy. Reports of superhuman feats began cropping up across the country, as more and more people started to display abilities similar to those seen at OmniTech. The world was changing, and there was no going back. Elizabeth and her team worked around the clock, trying to reverse the effects of the Nexus incident. But the more they studied it, the more they realized the energy wave had done more than just grant superhuman strength. It had altered the very fabric of human biology, enhancing not only strength but also speed, endurance, and even healing capabilities. Humanity was evolving, but at what cost? As governments and corporations scrambled to harness the power unleashed by the accident, a new arms race began. Military forces sought to weaponize the superhumans, while rogue factions formed, determined to seize control of this new era. Elizabeth watched in horror as the world she had once known slipped away, replaced by a chaotic reality where the line between human and superhuman blurred. She had unlocked something she couldn't fully understand, something that had the potential to either elevate humanity to new heights or destroy it entirely. And in the end, the only question that remained was this: would humanity's newfound power save them from themselves, or doom them to extinction? In the months following the Nexus incident, the world had become unrecognizable. Elizabeth Keller watched from her lab as entire cities adapted to the presence of superhumans, people who could lift cars with ease, leap over buildings, and even resist conventional weapons. The media dubbed it the surge, a worldwide awakening of human potential. What had once been contained to the OmniTech facility had spread rapidly, affecting millions. Governments scrambled to react. In the U.S., martial law had been declared in several cities after a series of violent clashes between newly empowered individuals and the police. Other nations weren't faring much better. Where the surge had granted power, it had also brought chaos. There was no roadmap for dealing with a world where ordinary citizens suddenly wielded extraordinary abilities. Elizabeth spent every waking hour in her lab, searching for answers. The Nexus energy wave had altered the quantum structure of human DNA, but she didn't know how or why. Every model she and her team built failed to predict the sheer randomness of the phenomenon. Some people developed strength, others speed. A few even displayed the ability to manipulate energy itself. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And then there were those who hadn't been so lucky. The unreported side of the surge was what kept Elizabeth awake at night. For every person who gained superhuman abilities, there were others whose bodies couldn't handle the sudden shift. Hospitals were overrun with people suffering from what the media called surge collapse, a condition where the quantum alterations caused internal organ failure, sometimes even death. Elizabeth had seen the data. For every hero the surge created, there was another whose life was destroyed. She couldn't help but feel responsible. After all, it was her experiment that had unleashed the surge in the first place. "Any progress?" Ian Foster asked as he walked into the lab, dark circles under his eyes. He, too, had been working tirelessly since the Nexus incident, trying to contain the fallout. Elizabeth sighed, rubbing her temples. None. Every model we run hits the same roadblock. We understand how the energy altered the DNA, but we can't figure out how to control or reverse it. Ian dropped into a chair across from her, his expression grim. We might not have the luxury of time. The government's talking about forced containment zones. Anyone with surge powers will be rounded up and, well, they're not saying what comes after that. Elizabeth's heart sank. Containment zones? Are they serious? Ian nodded. They're scared. Luz. The military is losing control. And you know what happens when governments get desperate. They start looking for extreme solutions. Elizabeth stood, pacing the room. This isn't just a national issue anymore. We're talking about global consequences. If governments start rounding up surge-powered individuals, we could be looking at a global conflict, a war we're not prepared for. Ian ran a hand through his hair. I know, but what do you suggest? Every day there are more reports of superhuman violence. People are using their powers to rob banks, topple buildings, and incite riots. It's not just heroes out there, Luz. It's villains, too. Elizabeth knew he was right. The surge had given rise to both heroes and criminals. Every major city now had its own super scene, individuals using their newfound abilities for their own ends. Some became vigilantes, trying to maintain order where the government couldn't. Others turned to crime, seeing their powers as an easy path to riches and control. And then there were the militaries. Reports had surfaced of several nations secretly recruiting surge-powered individuals into their ranks, weaponizing their abilities for strategic advantage. The arms race was no longer about nuclear stockpiles or advanced AI, it was about who could control the most powerful humans. I have an idea, Elizabeth said, her mind racing. It's risky, but it might be our only chance to prevent a total collapse. Ian leaned forward. I'm listening. We need to create a countermeasure, Elizabeth continued, her voice steady with determination. Something that can neutralize the effects of the surge, but selectively. We can't reverse the changes, but we might be able to contain them. Ian frowned. A neutralizer? That sounds dangerous. What if we make things worse? We won't know until we try, Elizabeth replied. But if we do nothing, the world is going to tear itself apart. This could be our only way to level the playing field. Ian sat back, deep in thought. He knew the risks. Any attempt to tamper with the surge could backfire, making the situation even more unstable. But as things stood, the world was already on the brink. If Elizabeth was right, this could be their only chance to avoid total chaos. All right, Ian said finally, let's do it. 4 weeks, Elizabeth and her team worked day and night, developing the surge neutralizer. It wasn't easy. The energy released by the Nexus experiment was unpredictable, and creating a device that could selectively dampen those effects required a level of precision they hadn't yet achieved. But Elizabeth was relentless. This was her responsibility, and she refused to give up. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of the junior researchers, Dr. Laura Mason, discovered that certain quantum frequencies could interfere with the energy fields generated by surge-altered individuals. By tuning the neutralizer to those frequencies, they could temporarily suppress a person's abilities without causing permanent harm. It's still experimental, Laura cautioned, as she demonstrated the prototype. But if we can scale this up, we might be able to neutralize the most dangerous surge-powered individuals. Elizabeth studied the device, a small, handheld emitter, nodding in approval. Good work, Laura. This could be exactly what we need. The first real test came sooner than expected. A group of surge-powered extremists calling themselves the Ascendants had taken over a city block in downtown New York, holding civilians hostage while demanding the government recognize their newfound power. Led by a former military officer known only as Titan, the Ascendants had already clashed with law enforcement several times, their abilities far outstripping anything the police or military could handle. Titan was a monster of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall and possessing strength that made Ian's earlier feats look like child's play. He had torn through military vehicles like paper, his skin seemingly impervious to bullets and explosives. The authorities had no way to stop him. Until now. Elizabeth, Ian, and Laura arrived at the scene with the surge neutralizer in hand, flanked by a squad of nervous soldiers. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of helicopters circling overhead. The Ascendants had fortified their position, daring anyone to challenge them. This is it, Ian said, gripping the neutralizer tightly. Let's hope this thing works. Elizabeth nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. This was their first field test, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The group approached cautiously, staying out of sight as they neared the Ascendant's barricade. Titan's deep, rumbling voice echoed through the streets as he issued another ultimatum to the government forces. He was giving them one last chance to surrender, or he would tear the city apart. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she watched him. This was the kind of power they were dealing with, raw, uncontrollable, and terrifying. Now, she whispered. Ian activated the neutralizer, and a low hum filled the air as the device emitted its quantum dampening pulse. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Titan froze mid-sentence. His massive body shuddered as the neutralizer's pulse took effect. His eyes widened in shock as he realized something was wrong. He tried to move, but his limbs felt sluggish, heavy. "It's working," Laura whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Titan let out a roar of frustration, but his strength was fading fast. The soldiers moved in, taking advantage of his weakened state to subdue him. Within minutes, the Ascendants had been neutralized, their powers suppressed by the device. Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. The surge had finally met its match. But as the team celebrated their success, a dark thought crept into Elizabeth's mind. The surge neutralizer had worked. Yes, but what now? They had created a tool that could suppress powers, but in the wrong hands. It could be used to control and manipulate those who had been altered by the surge. Had they just traded one danger for another? As the world reeled from the aftermath of the surge, Elizabeth realized that the true challenge had only just begun. Humanity had tasted power beyond its wildest dreams, and now, the battle to control that power would determine the fate of the world. And in that battle, there would be no easy answers. As the surge neutralizer's pulse silenced the streets of New York, Elizabeth Keller watched the once mighty Titan slump into unconsciousness, his powers suppressed. The soldiers moved quickly, cuffing and detaining the rest of the Ascendants, who offered little resistance now that their abilities had been neutralized. The government would likely claim this as a victory, a decisive moment in their fight to contain the chaos the surge had unleashed. But to Elizabeth, it felt like something far darker. She glanced at Ian and Laura, their faces showing signs of cautious relief. This was what they had worked for, a tool to restore order, a means to control the chaos. But the lingering doubt gnawed at her. The Nexus incident had transformed people, and now, the world was dividing into two camps, those who wielded power and those who sought to suppress it. "What now?" Ian asked, breaking the silence. "We can't neutralize everyone." Elizabeth shook her head, her thoughts racing. "No, we can't, and even if we could, it would only be temporary. People will resist. There are millions out there who don't want to be neutralized, and they won't let it happen without a fight." Laura approached, her expression uneasy. "I don't think we can rely on the government to handle this responsibly, either. We've just given them the ultimate tool for control. What happens when they start using it on innocent people, on anyone they see as a threat, surge-powered or not?" Elizabeth's heart sank. This was the danger she feared. The surge neutralizer had worked as intended, but now it risked being used to subjugate people, to force them into compliance. The same governments that were terrified of the surge would now have a way to oppress their own citizens. And worse, the neutralizer could end up in the hands of those seeking to dominate the surge-powered individuals for their own ends. She looked up at the sky, where helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the images of the captured Ascendants across the world. The message was clear: the powers of the surge could be tamed, but at what cost? "We can't let it end like this," Elizabeth said quietly. "We have to make sure the neutralizer isn't misused. We need to be the ones in control of how it's deployed, or we risk creating a new kind of tyranny." Ian nodded in agreement. "You're right, but that's a tall order. We're scientists, not politicians. The government will want to take this tech and run with it. We don't have to give them the final version," Elizabeth said, her mind settling on a dangerous plan. "We can modify the neutralizer so it's only used in emergencies on people who are actively causing harm. But more importantly, we need to figure out how to help people control their powers, not suppress them." "You mean, teach them?" Laura asked, frowning. "Yes," Elizabeth replied. "If we can find a way to help people harness their powers safely, we won't need to neutralize anyone. The surge is part of humanity now. We can't erase it, but we can learn to coexist with it." Ian was silent for a moment before speaking. "You're talking about an entirely new path." One where surge-powered individuals become a normal part of society. Elizabeth nodded. Exactly. The Nexus experiment opened a door we can't close, but we can decide how we walk through it. If we let fear guide us, we'll destroy ourselves. But if we embrace this change carefully, responsibly, we might be able to evolve into something better. Laura crossed her arms, deep in thought. That sounds great, but convincing the world won't be easy. People are terrified of what's happening. The Ascendants aren't exactly helping the cause. Elizabeth glanced at the subdued Titan, now being loaded into an armored vehicle by the military. People like him are why we need to act fast. If we don't show the world that the surge can be controlled through understanding, not suppression, we'll see more groups like the Ascendants rising up. Ian sighed. It's going to take time, and we're going to face resistance from both sides. I know, Elizabeth said, her voice steady, but this is our responsibility. We created this, and it's up to us to ensure it doesn't destroy everything. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth and her team worked in secret, modifying the surge neutralizer and developing training protocols for those affected by the Nexus energy wave. They called their initiative Project Resolve, a program designed to teach people how to control their abilities without resorting to dangerous suppression technology. It was a radical idea, and one that would face immense opposition. As the government pushed for wider deployment of the neutralizer, Elizabeth and her allies made their move. Using their connections at OmniTech and within the scientific community, they began spreading the word about Project Resolve. It started small, recruiting surge-powered individuals who wanted to learn control instead of fear. Word spread quickly, and soon, pockets of support emerged in cities around the world. Not everyone was on board. The Ascendants, though weakened, still had loyal followers who saw the surge as a means to claim dominance over the world. Other governments, meanwhile, accelerated their efforts to weaponize the surge for military use. Tensions escalated, and the threat of global conflict loomed larger every day. Elizabeth knew it wouldn't be easy. Project Resolve was a beacon of hope, but it was also a challenge to those who wanted to use the surge for power. Still, she pressed on, convinced that this was the only way forward. One day, as she sat at her desk reviewing the latest data on the Nexus energy field, Ian entered the room, a smile on his face. "We've done it," he said, holding up a tablet. The first group of surge-powered individuals just completed their training. They're in full control of their abilities. No accidents, no loss of control. It's working, Luz. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. That's incredible, Ian. It's just the beginning, but it's a huge step. Ian nodded, his smile fading as he glanced at the screen. Yeah, but we're still facing resistance. The military wants the neutralizer in every city, and there's a lot of pressure to shut down Project Resolve. They're scared of what people can do. I know, Elizabeth said softly, but we have to keep going. People need to see that the surge doesn't have to be feared, it can be understood. As the world continued to change, Elizabeth found herself at the forefront of a new era. The surge had altered humanity forever, and there was no going back. But with Project Resolve, she hoped to show the world that they could move forward together. It would take time, it would take patience, but Elizabeth Keller was determined to see it through. The Nexus experiment had unlocked a new potential for humanity, and now it was up to them to decide how to use it. For better or worse, the future was in their hands.